Derek Chauvin's fate is now in the hands of the jury. The prosecution and defense presented their closing arguments today.
Believe your eyes. What you saw happen, happened. This was an authorized use of force, as unattractive as it may be.
We are live in Minneapolis with a closer look at the closing arguments and the preparations ahead of the jury's decision.
After nearly 3 weeks of testimony, closing arguments wrapped up today in Derek Chauvin's murder trial. The prosecution has worked to convince jurors that the former Minneapolis police officer killed Houston native George Floyd.
The defense argues Floyd's drug use or medical problems may have been the reason Floyd died, and now the jury is deliberating Chauvin's fate. KPRC2's Chris Gutierrez and Brandon Walker are in Minneapolis covering the trial for us. Our team coverage begins right now with Chris outside the courthouse. Chris?
Yeah, hi, good evening to you, Lauren and Andy. I will be honest with you that we noticed our first signs of what the magnitude of what's going on here when we landed last night, and the flight attendant urged everyone on our plane to actually try to avoid this downtown district if we could. Take a look. This is what we saw today as we hopped in our car and we drove around building after building, row after row. Most of downtown, many buildings down here are now boarded up because of the unrest that is anticipated given what could potentially happen with the verdict here. You have to keep in mind that in Southeast Texas, we're used to seeing boarded up buildings during hurricane season, but right now it's that storm of emotion and so much uncertainty that has really turned this community into a tinderbox of uncertainty, and that's why the downtown district looks like this. Take a look at this. In fact, the downtown courthouse that you see right here behind me is actually fortified with 2 different chain link fences, and it's wrapped with razor wire on top. The governor has deployed 3,000 National Guard troops to this downtown region. It's part of what they're calling Operation Safety Net to ensure that they are able to maintain peace in this downtown region. Keep in mind, for perspective, we're less than 10 miles away from Brooklyn Center. That's the site of the Dante Wright shooting by the hands of police in the same community less than 2 weeks ago. So you have to keep all of that into perspective, keep all of that in mind. And as we turn now to this Derek Chauvin trial, I will tell you that the jury is now in its first hour of deliberations. This after what was a lengthy day of closing arguments. For more on that, we turn now to my colleague Brandon Walker, who joins me live in Minneapolis tonight for more on that. Brandon, good evening to you.
And good evening to you, Chris. Some 7 hours, in fact, closing arguments went on, starting with the prosecution. That lasted about 1 hour and 42 minutes. Then the defense had its turn. That went well over 2.5 hours, almost 3. At that point, the prosecution was able to come back with the rebuttal. The point here from the prosecution, the video that you saw speaks for itself. However, the defense says that there's a larger context that you need to take into consideration when figuring out what Derek Chauvin did that day.
This wasn't policing. This was murder.
Common sense, said Special Prosecutor Steve Schleicher to jurors, is all they need to know Derek Chauvin is guilty.
Use your common sense. Believe your eyes. What you saw, you saw.
What Special Prosecutor Schleicher says the world saw was Derek Chauvin's knee pressed on George Floyd's neck for 9 minutes, 29 seconds.
When he was unable to speak, the defendant continued. When he was unable to breathe, the defendant continued beyond the point that he had a pulse. 9 minutes, 29 seconds. It's not the proper analysis because the 9 minutes and 29 seconds ignores the previous 16 minutes and 59 seconds.
Defense attorney Eric Nelson argued what happened before Floyd was pinned to the ground explains why he was pinned. Resisting arrest, he argued. That, coupled with the growing crowd, made Chauvin's actions within the understanding of reasonable force.
These are the actions of a reasonable police officer.
But we believe at a reflection point.
George Floyd's family, including his youngest daughter Gianna, faith and political leaders, held a prayer vigil outside of the courthouse during a lunch break.
I'd like to thank the community and also like to thank everybody around the world.
Also present, Houston Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, who says the right side here is clear.
I don't think any police officer or reasonable person would view sitting on the neck of a human being after he has expired or making no effort for a duty of care to intervene would view that as reasonable behavior.
And Congresswoman Jackson Lee says she understands that jurors will take that into consideration. She says that point is clear. She also says, Chris, the defense's point that the other 17 minutes needs to be taken into consideration is nonsense, because she says the video for those 9 minutes, 29 seconds speaks for itself. And that's what she says, and that's what the experts say killed George Floyd.
Hey, Brandon, before you go, we should point out that the 9 minutes and 29 seconds that Officer Chauvin was on George Floyd's neck has become kind of the crucial point of this case. A lot of people making that viral video shot from different angles, even the body camera video that highlights that, and we can see that. But again, the defense argues it's that 16 minutes and 59 seconds leading up to that proves why that was necessary. In fact, the defense, Brandon, I may get this wrong, but don't quote me, but they called it, they said it was awful but lawful. What did you make of that?
So the point there is reasonable doubt, right? So when you take into consideration those previous 17 minutes, starting with the initial phone calls coming from the Cup Foods, what the defense argues was George Floyd resisting arrest, leading to the point of him being pinned to the ground. They say all of that contributes to the actions Derek Chauvin made that day. Reasonable force, they say, because it was an uncontrolled situation. They also pointed to George Floyd's drug abuse, as we've talked about throughout our coverage of this trial, to suggest that ultimately, if he was addicted to drugs, if he was ultimately high off fentanyl, and if fentanyl was in his system, the defense is arguing that has to contribute to his death. But again, the prosecution arguing that is nonsense, because the knee is what tells the full story.
Brandon Walker live here in Minneapolis as the jury continues to deliberate. They're looking at charges that include second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. Again, they're just now beginning the deliberations. They're about an hour in after what was 7 hours, a full day, really, of back and forth from the prosecution and both the defense in their closing arguments. We will have much more for you coming up tonight at 6. Back to you guys in the studio.
A lot for jurors to talk about amongst themselves. Chris, thanks so much. Our coverage of the Derek Chauvin trial extends online. You can watch the closing arguments and find updates on this case on our website, click2houston.com.